grand chamber of Tovara hummed with restless whispers. King Orin of the Altesh people sat upon his elevated throne, worry etched into his features. At his side stood his daughter, Princess Safina, her pale mint-colored skin faintly reflecting the glow of crystalline lanterns. Yet, despite her regal bearing, she was frail by Altesh standards. A people who measured status by physical prowess, Safina struggled even to heft the ceremonial blades of her heritage, and so the royal council grew impatient. "Your Majesty," one advisor said solemnly, "the princess lacks the strength to lead us. It is unwise to pretend otherwise." King Orin clenched his jaw. His daughter was his only child, his sole heir. He had spent years seeking remedies, special diets, genetic recalibrations, even arcane rites, but none had cured Safina's fragility. Then came rumors from distant star systems of a resilient species, the people of Arden. Humans, it was said, were adaptable beyond measure, survivors no matter the hardship. "Summon an Ardinian," King Orin declared, silencing further protests. "He shall train the princess on Arden." Ethan Cole was busy tending to the simple life he had built for himself, a secluded cabin on a forested ridge of Ardennes, when the call reached him. A retired soldier, Ethan had a history of making quick decisions under pressure, but these days he preferred the quiet life, chopping firewood, tinkering with outdated machinery in his workshop. The message was concise. "King Orin of Tovara requests your service. Train the princess. Her survival depends on it." What exactly am I supposed to teach her? Ethan wondered aloud. The next day, a sleek Altesh craft descended into the clearing beside Ethan's cabin. Out stepped Princess Safina, her posture regal, even though Arden's heavier gravity clearly taxed her. She surveyed the humble surroundings, her voice tinged with disdain. "This cottage is my accommodation?" she asked, pressing a hand to her forehead. Ethan folded his arms, unimpressed by her tone. "If you were expecting a palace, you chose the wrong planet, princess." Safina bristled at his bluntness, but remained silent. The tension between them was thick as they settled inside. Even drawing water from the nearby well left the princess winded, and ascending a mere flight of stairs was a grueling challenge. Ethan observed quietly, gauging her frustration. That evening they shared a sparse meal, roasted root vegetables grown in the garden. Safina finally snapped. "Why am I here? My father sends me to this backwater world to train with a stranger. How can you possibly help me?" Ethan took a breath. "Your father believes in you. My job is to prove he's right," Safina scoffed, tapping her shaking fingers against the table. "Have you seen me? I can barely lift a wooden cup." Ethan allowed a small smile. "Strength isn't just muscle and brawn. It's ingenuity, resilience, and understanding your own limits, so you can push past them. Humans aren't the mightiest species in the galaxy, but we adapt. We survive, and so will you if you're willing to try." For a moment, Safina's bravado faltered. She wanted to believe him. But a lifetime of being called weak was etched into her heart. "And if I fail?" Justinian smiled, those rows and rows of teeth, as they were supposed to. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "You'll fail, knowing you tried your best, but I don't believe failure is your destiny." The following sunrise, Ethan began Safina's training with understated methods. Short hikes, small weights strapped to her wrists and ankles, balancing on uneven surfaces. She complained incessantly, yet Ethan never scolded her. When she stumbled, he simply extended a hand and said, "Again." By dusk, her limbs felt like they were made of lead, and she collapsed onto the cabin's rough-hewn floor. "You're torturing me," she seethed. "No," Ethan said, offering her a water flask. "This is progress." Later, as the celestial glow filled the sky, Safina found herself gazing through the cabin window. For the first time, a flicker of hope stirred in her chest. Perhaps she could surpass everyone's expectations. Outside, Ethan watched her silhouette from the porch, a faint smile crossing his face. Their path was only beginning. Training on Arden proved more punishing than Safina had anticipated. Each morning, Ethan woke her at dawn with a firm but calm call. "Up and at 'em, princess. The world won't wait." She rolled her eyes. "Stop calling me that," she muttered, sluggishly rising from her cot. "When you quit acting like royalty," Ethan retorted with a playful smirk, "I'll stop." Their daily drills were a medley of simple chores that felt colossal to Safina. Chopping wood, hauling buckets of water, crossing narrow logs. Arden's dense gravity weighed her down relentlessly, and the rugged terrain offered zero sympathy. One afternoon, she trudged up a steep hill with a backpack of rocks strapped to her shoulders. About halfway up, her foot slipped, and she pitched forward into the dirt. She lay still for a moment, her eyes closed. She felt as if she were dying. "This is pointless," she shouted, flinging off the pack in frustration. "I'll never match your strength." Ethan crouched beside her, calm and unyielding. "Good. You don't need to match me. You need to be better." A wave of anger and tears threatened to overwhelm her. "You know nothing of what it's like to be branded weak. My people have shamed me for years." His expression softened. Brushing dirt from her sleeves, he sat next to her. "You might be surprised how much I do understand. I was the smallest kid in my squad back in training. No one believed in me either." He pointed up the slope. "You don't prove people wrong by quitting. You prove them wrong by standing up again, no matter how many times you slip." Safina followed his gaze to the hill, lungs still burning. Part of her wanted to remain down in the dirt, but his words kindled something. She lifted the pack and stood, legs quivering. She muttered. By the week's end, Safina begrudgingly conceded a measure of respect for Ethan. He pushed her to her limits but never passed them, and he always acknowledged her successes, however small. They still clashed over culture shock. One night, Safina's stomach turned as she watched Ethan stir a vegetable stew over a crackling fire. Safina's voice crackled over the speakers, hiding their conversation with the Nazis. "You eat plants?" she asked in disbelief. He raised a brow. "I do. They're good for you. Want some?" She looked horrified. "We only use synthetic protein capsules back home. This is primitive." Ethan laughed. "If you plan on surviving in the real world, you'd best appreciate basic foods. Try it." Hesitant, Safina sampled a spoonful. Her eyes widened. "It's not the worst." Ethan grinned. "That's pretty high praise coming from you." Her daily progress was undeniable. Though she still slipped and stumbled, she gradually adjusted to Arden's environment. One afternoon, Ethan introduced an old punching bag strung from a sturdy branch. "Today we focus on precision and endurance," he said, giving the bag a shove. "Try it." At first, Safina's strikes were feeble. Ethan stepped behind her, carefully adjusting her stance. "Balance your weight. Use your core, not just your arms." By the session's end, her knuckles throbbed, and her arms felt limp. Yet, in Ethan's eyes, she glimpsed approval. "Good job," he said softly. "I can see your determination." Safina allowed the smallest smile. "You might be somewhat competent as a teacher after all." He chuckled. "Princess, that almost sounded like gratitude." That evening, she gazed at the brilliant stars arching across the sky. She was still far from strong by any measure, but she no longer felt so powerless. Safina's training continued in a steady rhythm. Day after day, she woke to the sunrise, ran drills, and pushed her boundaries. In time, Hauling buckets no longer left her breathless, and the old punching bag began to sway more forcefully with her hits. One chilly morning, Ethan nodded toward the bag. "Let's see what you've got, Safina." She obliged, throwing punch after punch until her muscles quivered. Still, she refused to surrender. "Again," Ethan said. Her arms burned as she landed one last blow. Then she sank to the ground, sweat trickling down her temples. "You always say I'm getting there, but it doesn't feel that way." Ethan tossed her a flask of water. "You don't see the changes, but I do." Safina stared at the dirt floor. She wanted to believe him, though doubt lingered. Yet she couldn't deny that compared to her old self, she felt different, stronger. Not. End of chapter 42. That evening, a raging storm tore across the forest, pounding the cabin with torrential rain. Ethan kindled a small fire in the fireplace. Safina sat near it, her eyes reflecting the flames. Ethan paused from his tinkering. "I don't just think it. I know it. Strength isn't solely about how much you can lift. Sometimes it's about staying in the fight when every muscle screams at you to give up." Safina frowned. "My people define everything by physical power. If I can't prove otherwise, I'll forever be the pathetic princess." Ethan set aside his tools. "Listen, I've witnessed huge, hulking fighters crumble under pressure. True resilience is more than physique. It's heart. And you have more heart than you give yourself credit for." She absorbed his words, staring into the flickering light. Maybe, just maybe, he was right. The next day, Ethan led her to a swift-flowing river near the forest edge. The water rushed over jagged stones, glinting ominously in the pale sunlight. "What are we doing here?" Safina asked, wiping her palms on her trousers. "You're crossing it," Ethan replied casually. "The current's strong and the rocks are slippery. Stay focused on what you've learned, and you'll manage." Safina studied the churning water. "And if I'm swept away?" Ethan shrugged. "Then you fight your way back. Now go." Tentatively, she stepped into the frigid water. The current threatened to throw her off balance with every step. Her heart thumped, but she reminded herself of each lesson she'd practiced. Gritting her teeth, she advanced. Halfway through, she lost her footing and plunged in head first. The force of the current pulled her downstream, panic flaring like a siren in her mind. "Keep your head up," Ethan shouted from the bank. "Remember your training." Desperation fueled her as she thrashed, arms and legs burning with effort. At last, she latched onto a protruding rock and hoisted herself to the opposite shore. Collapsing onto the muddy bank, she gulped for air. Ethan jogged over, grinning. "You did it." "Eh? Didn't I tell you?" She stared at him, still trembling. "That was terrifying." He offered a hand to help her stand. "And you conquered it. That's bravery, Safina." From that day forward, something within her shifted. She approached challenges with a renewed resolve. Though doubts lingered, they no longer controlled her. Weeks passed in this manner. Safina's stamina climbed, her mindset sharpened, her body adapted, while her spirit hardened, yet not into cruelty, but into a confident steadiness. She learned survival tactics, practiced archery on improvised targets, and sparred with Ethan using wooden staffs he'd crafted. Though he often bested her, each small improvement sparked pride in her teacher's eyes. One evening, Ethan presented Safina with a basic, well-forged dagger. The hilt fit neatly in her hand. "This belongs to you now," he said. "Earned it." She turned it over in her palm, the metal gleaming in the cabin's lamplight. "Thank you," she whispered. "A weapon's just a tool," Ethan advised. The real power comes from the one using it. Safina nodded thoughtfully, feeling more a warrior every day. Early one morning, a thunderous roar shattered the tranquility. Alarmed, Safina grabbed her staff. "What was that?" Ethan held up a hand. "Stay alert." They crept through the woods until a large beast, all scales and rancorous howls, barreled into view. Its claws raked the ground with lethal purpose, and it zeroed in on them. Ethan stepped forward, knife in hand. "We've come too far for you to panic now," he said. "Spot its weak point." The creature charged. Ethan slashed at its flank, drawing a furious bellow. Injured, it spun toward Safina. Every instinct urged her to flee, but she forced her feet to stay planted. She recalled Ethan's pointers. "Channel your training." She sidestepped at the final moment and swung her staff in a precise arc, striking the beast's joint where the scales parted. It staggered, giving Ethan time to deliver a decisive blow. As the monstrous figure collapsed, Safina stood breathless, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "You did it," Ethan said, breathing heavily. "See? You're stronger than you believe." Safina stared at the fallen creature, realization washing over her. She could fight. She could defend herself. And maybe others too. That night, while they sat around a modest fire inside the cabin, Safina twirled the dagger in her hand, replaying the day's events. She had ventured beyond theoretical drills into actual survival, and she hadn't faltered. "You've come a long way," Ethan remarked softly. Safina looked at him, determination in her gaze. "And I'm just getting started." Their routine continued unabated until one crisp morning when a Tavaran scout ship landed beside the cabin. A royal guard exited, bowing to Safina. "Princess, King Oranda requests your immediate return," he said gravely. "Tovara is under siege." Safina's heart lurched. She glanced at Ethan. "But I'm still in training." The guard shook his head. "Your father believes you are ready. The Nauru fleet has broken through our defenses. We need you." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Trust in yourself. This is what you've worked for." Safina inhaled sharply. "Then let's go." The trip home was somber. The guard briefed Safina and Ethan on the dire circumstances. A ruthless species called the Nauru had launched a sudden offensive, ravaging Tavara's strongholds. When they arrived, the once pristine capital lay in ruins. Pillars of smoke rose into the sky, and injured civilians sought refuge in makeshift shelters. Soldiers rushed about, coordinating hasty defense plans. Safina and Ethan were escorted to the palace's command center, where King Orin waited. His normally robust features looked haggard from worry. "Safina?" he said, relief and uncertainty warring in his voice. Then he acknowledged Ethan. "And you must be the human instructor. Is she truly prepared?" Ethan's confidence did not waver. "She has what it takes." Safina's posture stiffened. "What's our strategy, Father?" King Orin brought up a holographic display of the Nauru's troop movements. "They hold the northern defenses. We must reclaim them before they can overwhelm the city center." Safina studied the map through the lens of Ethan's teachings. "A diversion might work," she suggested. "If we draw them eastward, we can strike the north at its weakest points." The chamber fell quiet. Some council members exchanged skeptical looks, but Ethan broke the silence. "It's a sound plan. The Nauru commander is arrogant. He'll take the bait." King Orin nodded. "Very well. Safina, you will lead the diversion." Her stomach clenched. Though she had trained for this, the reality felt enormous, but she forced herself to focus. "Understood." As her forces moved out, Safina took a central position. The Nauru were intimidatingly formidable, but she clung to every tactic Ethan had instilled in her. When the moment came, she gave the order to launch the feint to the east, successfully luring a portion of enemy troops away from the true target. Safina and her main force then swept northward. Energy blasts streaked across the skyline as they reclaimed the battered fortifications. By nightfall, the northern defenses belonged to Tavara once more. Exhausted and scraped up from minor skirmishes, Safina stood with her comrades, the pungent scent of smoldering debris drifting through the air. For the first time in her life, she felt worthy in the eyes of her people. Not because of her title, but because she had led them to victory. Back in the command center, a blend of relief and tension filled the hall. They had staved off defeat, but the Nauru's main forces remained at large. Safina studied the map, noting the next probable strike. "They'll regroup soon," she said. "We can't just sit here." A high-ranking general, battle-worn and skeptical, arched an eyebrow. "One victory is not the war, Princess." She did not waver, recalling Ethan's advice to stay calm under pressure. "Which is why we press our advantage. Their supply lines must be cut." King Orin observed his daughter closely, pride slowly replacing doubt. "We proceed with her plan. We cannot hesitate." Though some advisors looked uncertain, they complied. Safina gathered her strike team, with Ethan acting as tactical consultant, and they set off into the rugged terrain surrounding the city. Under cover of night, they located the Nauru supply caravans guarded by squads of elite warriors. Safina split her group, orchestrating distractions to draw enemy scouts away. She and a few others sneaked in to plant explosives on the largest carriers. The plan went smoothly, until a Nauru guard noticed them at the last moment, raising the alarm. Gunfire erupted in the darkness. Safina's squad fled into the trees just before the charges detonated, lighting the sky with rolling waves of orange flame. Though the supply lines were successfully destroyed, the Nauru scrambled to retaliate. Safina and her team dashed through moonlit undergrowth, chased by furious enemy forces. Thanks to Ethan's level-headed guidance, they reached their extraction point and escaped in an Altesh transport. When they returned, the atmosphere in the capital was buoyed by hope. Another crucial blow had been dealt to the invaders. King Orin clasped Safina's hands, his voice heavy with admiration. "Your courage has exceeded all expectations, my daughter." She nodded, taking a steadying breath. "This war isn't over, Father. We must finish what we've started." As the conflict escalated, Safina found herself coordinating both ground and aerial assaults. The Nauru flagship made a final push, looming menacingly in Tavara's skies. On the command deck, King Orin and his advisors circled around a holographic map, the flickering lights reflecting off anxious faces. Ethan stepped up beside Safina, tapping the display. "Hit them where they're vulnerable. Don't try a head-to-head fight with a larger fleet. Exploit their blind spots." Safina relayed orders to Tavara's battered squadrons. Her voice rang out across comm channels. "Focus on isolated targets, then converge on their main ship." Fighter craft screamed through the atmosphere, launching volley after volley at the Nauru warships. Meanwhile, the city's defenses held steady, thanks to the crucial fortifications Safina had reclaimed. She piloted a nimble Altesh fighter, Ethan in the co-pilot seat, scanning the battlefield. The larger Nauru carriers were formidable, but Tavara's forces had a tactical edge now. Eventually, the flagship descended low enough for a daring insertion. Safina led a strike team aboard, weaving through corridors bristling with enemy troops. Blaster fire crisscrossed in claustrophobic hallways. Though the fight was fierce, Safina's training and newfound self-assurance guided her blade and aim. They reached the engine core, planting explosives that would cripple the massive vessel. Alarms blared as the Nauru rushed to stop them, but Safina's squad defended each other until the countdown demanded a hasty retreat. They fled just before the catastrophic blast tore the flagship apart in a dazzling eruption visible across the planet's surface. Several 100,000 square kilometers on the ground exploded in a deadly eruption visible across the planet's surface. With their flagship gone, the remaining Nauru forces scattered. The battered capital's defenders erupted in victorious cheers. King Orin embraced his daughter, tears in his eyes. "Safina, you have done for Tavara what I could never have achieved alone." She, still breathless from the final sprint, stepped back to include Ethan in their circle. "We all fought for this. I just did what needed to be done." Ethan's face shone with pride. "You saved them, Safina. You proved everyone wrong, especially yourself." The days that followed were a patchwork of celebration and rebuilding. The city's skyline, once marred by smoke, was slowly restored. But the scars of war lingered. Civilians and soldiers alike worked to clear rubble and mend damaged structures. Safina traversed the recovering streets, feeling a new sense of belonging. Gone were the sidelong looks of doubt and scorn. In their place were nods of gratitude and respect. One afternoon, Ethan joined her on a walk near the palace gardens, which were miraculously untouched by the fighting. He smirked. "Skipping the festivities, Princess?" She shook her head with a soft laugh. "A little applause goes a long way. I need some quiet." His gaze drifted to the vibrant blooms. "You've earned the cheering. Your people are here today because of you." She paused, tracing a petal with her fingertip. "No, Ethan. They're here because of us." The next day, she addressed the newly gathered council. Many of them had once doubted her, but the battles had transformed their skepticism into admiration. King Orin stood proudly beside her. "We must rebuild our cities and our unity," Safina said in a clear voice. "Our success depended on all of us working together. We'll stay vigilant, so that no threat can divide us again." A thunderous applause filled the hall. Her father's eyes shone with approval. "Safina, you have proven that strength takes many forms. You are the future of Tovara." For weeks, and then months, Safina dedicated herself to restoration efforts. She traveled from village to village, offering support and listening to her people's fears and hopes. In every corner of Tovara, she witnessed the resolve she had helped awaken. Ethan accompanied her throughout her journeys, providing logistical advice and lending a skilled hand where needed. "Remember when you first arrived at my cabin?" he joked one evening around a campfire. "I was sure you wouldn't last a week." Safina gave him a mock glare. "I nearly didn't, but you never gave me the chance to give up." He shrugged. "I don't mentor quitters." A comfortable silence settled between them. Then, softly, Safina said, "Thank you for everything, Ethan." He answered with a fond half-smile. "Don't mention it. Watching you become who you are now is reward enough." She reached out, placing a hand over his. "Then stay. Help me shape Tavara into something better." Ethan exhaled. "Arden was my home. But maybe Tovara can be too," said Adrian. "Tovara is my home," Ignatius answered. "It has been my—" Her grin in response was genuine and relieved. "Good. I'm not done learning from you yet." In the years that followed, Princess Safina's deeds became legend in Tovara. Children grew up hearing tales of her fortitude and the human who guided her transformation from a frail heir into a revered warrior. Standing atop a newly rebuilt balcony at the palace, Safina surveyed the thriving capital. Buildings rose taller, stronger than before. In the golden light of late afternoon, the city's spires gleamed with fresh possibility. Ethan joined her, faint lines of age etched around his eyes, but his spirit undiminished. "Look at what you've accomplished." She smiled, gaze drifting over the horizon. "No. Look at what we've accomplished." As dusk settled in a glowing arc, Safina felt the comforting weight of a destiny fulfilled. Though challenges would inevitably come, she was no longer powerless. She was a leader, a defender, and a beacon of unity for her people. Thus began the next chapter of Princess Safina's life. A story of hope, perseverance, and unbreakable resolve. her legacy only just unfolding before the stars.